Thank you, and I wish good health to all of you and your families. This solar array in Golden Gate National Recreation Area is a real solution to the global problem of human-caused climate change. And congratulations to the park, the green team, especially Laura and Carrie, for making Golden Gate climate neutral. And I know everybody's muted, but I will give it. Maybe you'll congratulate yourselves and the park for this great achievement. Now, this array contributed to an acceleration of renewable energy that has increased to 11% of global energy generation, and in the past 10 years has added a renewable electricity generating capacity globally equivalent to 1,200 nuclear power plants. Today, I will aim to give you a scientific foundation on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions briefly. Through my assessment of the published scientific literature, my own publications, and provide you encouragement by describing how your local actions are contributing to global progress. And anyway, I'm showing you some links here for scientific resources. And as Laura said, afterwards, you'll have the PDF file of this presentation. You're going to see a lot of scientific references and some figures. So you don't need to worry about writing that down. You'll have the PDF file for your reference. I'm going to cover the topics in these four sections and briefly start with the historical changes that have been detected in the field, and analyses have attributed them to anthropogenic climate change more than other factors. And this all starts, of course, with carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas, which in geologic time goes up and down with orbital cycles, as you see here in the graph going back 800,000 years. Regrettably, you see this straight line at the very end is all of human history from the Industrial Revolution to today. And last year, the average greenhouse gas, the average carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere reached 410, shot up out of the graph, way beyond the natural range of variability. Consequently, global temperature has increased to its hottest level in 800 years, the period of reconstruction of temperatures, and almost the highest in 2,000 years. And an analysis by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the panel that produces the authoritative assessments of anthropogenic climate change, and I've served as a lead author on 4 of the assessments of the IPCC, and have been grateful. Our work was recognized with a share of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, the IPCC has examined all of the potential causal factors, and you can see in the top here the heating from weather station measurements, and each of the small graphs that added together equals the top graph. Basically, the temperature signal has been decomposed into its component parts. And we see that all of the factors are either cyclical or periodic. The only factor that has gone up in a statistically significant way are greenhouse gas emissions, carbon pollution from cars, power plants, deforestation, and other human sources. Human activities cause climate change. Complete scientific agreement on that. So consequently, the global temperatures have increased, and they've increased more at higher latitudes in the Arctic and in mountain areas because the atmosphere is thinner, so it's easier to heat. Colleagues and I published the first analysis, spatial analysis of climate change trends across the 50 United States at a moderate resolution, 800 meter spatial resolution, and the first analysis across all of the US national parks. And we found that climate change has exposed the national parks to conditions hotter and drier than the country as a whole. And you see here that the temperature has increased at twice the national rate in the national parks compared to the US as a whole. Very statistically significant. And zooming in on the Bay Area, we see higher than average rates of temperature increase, annual temperature increase, particularly in the North Bay, up to 1.4 degrees Celsius or 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, climate change has heated the area of the 419 U.S. national parks at 1.1 degrees since 1895. Now, that might not sound like a lot, 1.1 degrees, but it's the equivalent of pushing a mountain down 170 meters or over 560 feet from cool areas up above to warmer areas below, pushing a mountain down the equivalent of the height of the Washington Monument. So small increments in temperature can produce major substantial impacts on the ground. Climate change is generally increasing precipitation around the world, but in some places it has caused severe droughts, and the southwestern US is one of those places, including California. The national parks have been disproportionately exposed to drier conditions than the country as a whole also. And when we zoom in on the Bay Area, we actually see Muir Woods is in one of these areas of drying, including also parts of Golden Gate National Recreation Area and Point Reyes National Seashore. So I'm going to briefly show you some of the major impacts, historical impacts that have been detected and attributed to human-caused climate change. And regrettably, the heat of climate change has contributed to the deaths of hundreds of people in Arizona and Southern California in heat waves. And regrettably, climate change has contributed to the extinction of the golden toad in Costa Rica and other amphibian species as the climate change has lifted the cloud deck of the cloud forest. Climate change has doubled wildfire across the western US compared to what would have burned naturally. And it's also doubled tree death across the western US from drought, wildfire, and bark beetle infestations. Golden Gate National Recreation Area hosts the tidal gauge with the longest sea level time series in the Western Hemisphere, and it's located here off Crissy, on that pier off Crissy Field, operated by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And climate change has raised sea level about halfway to your knee since 1854. And climate change has also shifted winter bird ranges north across the US, including the rock wren in Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Climate change has bleached coral reefs around the world, the hot water. And climate change has acidified Pacific Ocean waters 40%. And that's because the increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere naturally dissolves in the water and forms a weak carbonic acid. And so the pH has declined and the acidity in the Pacific has increased by 40%, including off Cabrillo National Monument. So to examine future risks, the IPCC has developed scenarios, emission scenarios, and these are all based on greenhouse gas emissions pathways, RCP, representative concentration pathway. And of course, the The path of no action is this red line, RCP 8.5. And the blue line is a world that achieves greenhouse gas emissions reductions to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. So these emission scenarios are storylines of the future that include population growth, energy use, and economic activity. So looking at projecting into the future is a function of human behavior, of what we do in the future. So all of your actions actually contribute to moving us from currently we're in between the orange and red lines, and all of your actions actually contribute to pushing it down to the orange, blue, and blue lines. This analysis across the all of the U.S. national parks, we see that for the highest emission scenario, the temperature in the average temperature across the national parks could increase by 6 degrees Celsius. That's approximately 9 degrees Fahrenheit. And the highest rates are in the Arctic. The highest potential rates are in the Arctic, up to 10 degrees Celsius. That's up to 16 degrees Fahrenheit in Alaska. The good news is, you see this this green line is the Paris Agreement goal, and your actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions contribute to getting us to that green line, which would be a reduction of 2/3 of the potential heating. The increase in heat and other changes of human-caused climate change increases the risks of animal and plant extinctions up to 5 times historical rates. But cutting greenhouse gas emissions could reduce the risks by 2/3. Climate change could increase wildfire frequencies up to 50% across 1/3 of global land by the end of the century. And in California, it could triple wildfire frequencies. But cutting greenhouse gas emissions could reduce wildfire risk in California by half. At Crissy Field, under the highest emissions scenario, we see this vulnerability analysis from CMG Landscape Architects for the park indicates that sea level rise could inundate much of Crissy Field. But by cutting greenhouse gas emissions, you can keep the sea level rise moderate and manageable. So you see, your actions can contribute directly to conserving park resources. For the rest of the presentation, I'll go through the global and local emissions, and then end up talking about some of the emissions reductions from specific solutions. So this is the carbon budget for 2018, the last full year for which we have data. And you see here that the combination of cars, power plants, deforestation, human activities pumps 42 billion, it pumps the equivalent of 42 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year. And oceans, vegetation, trees, and soil remove approximately 22 of that. The remainder, 19 billion tons, goes into the atmosphere and accumulates. And it's that fundamental imbalance that causes climate change. So climate change, the greenhouse gas emissions have doubled at a very rapid rate, have increased at a very rapid rate, doubling since 1972. The deforestation part, which is mainly deforestation in the tropics, is 13%, and it's hovered at that level for the past few decades. So we see that the vast majority of the emissions are from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Fires, of course, produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, but the analysis of field data and remote sensing on fires estimates a rate of about 1.5 billion tons per year. So globally, that amounts to just 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So while fires may be very visible, they're not a major, one of the biggest causes of climate change. Actually, again, fossil fuels are the burning of fossil fuels are the vast majority, produce the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions. And globally, most of the greenhouse gas emissions come from burning fossil fuels to generate electricity and heating. And we see here globally that transport is about 1/5. Now, we can look at the rankings of countries in many different ways. If we look at it as total national emissions, China emits the most greenhouse gas emissions now. Their emissions have greatly increased just in the past decade because of the industrialization of the country, and surpassed the US approximately 15 years ago in total emissions. However, the United States actually emits more greenhouse gas emissions per person. So the total emissions are a function of population, and then energy use per person, and then carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas per unit of energy. And even though the US only has 4 to 5% of the global population, it produces 15% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The picture is, of course, more complex than that. The world economy has integrated to a greater and greater extent in the past 2 decades. And much of the industrial production that had occurred in Europe and the United States has shifted over to China. So the production of material products, and a lot of the products are produced in China and then the United States and Europe imports those products. So even if the emissions are generated in China, it's really the consumption in the US and Europe that's responsible for those the emissions tied to those to that production. So not all of the greenhouse gas emissions have increased greatly in China, but some of that is actually tied to US and European consumption. The good news is that renewable energy capacity has accelerated, tripling since 2002. And as I mentioned in the introduction, just in the past decade, capacity has been capacity has been increased. That's equivalent to 1,200 nuclear power plants, including these offshore windmills in Denmark. And the IPCC has examined all of the different options for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in the special report aimed at assessing the Paris Agreement goal, concluded that it is still possible with concerted global action for us to limit the global temperature increase to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. That is very challenging, of course, but it is still feasible. In the United States, another piece of good news is that we cut greenhouse gas emissions 13% through 2017. And much of that was due to the leadership of the Obama administration in increasing renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency and energy conservation. But of course, regrettably, the emissions have started to increase in 2018. But the good news is that despite the current administration denying science and blocking action on climate change, 24 US states and Puerto Rico have come together and organized the US Climate Alliance, pledging to meet the Paris Agreement goals and have reduced their emissions 16% since 2005, on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And this is through renewable energy, like here, one of the first wind farms in California down by Joshua Tree. Another piece of good news is that renewable energy systems installed capacity has increased greatly in the US, and in 2019 produced almost 1/5 of US electricity. But we need to keep in mind the inherent inefficiency of fossil fuel energy. One of the great advantages of solar is that the solar voltaics is that the photons in sunlight actually hit the materials in the photovoltaic cells and move electrons, and so directly initiate electricity within the photovoltaic cell. In contrast, the burning of fossil fuels is a transfer of energy to heat and to motion, which is transferred in the case of a car to the driving of the drive shaft. And the physics of that process induce a theoretical limit on the efficiency. And we see in this diagram from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory that these are on the left side, the energy sources, and on the right side is the end point. And the dark gray here is useful energy, and the light gray here is waste energy. And 2/3 of fossil fuel energy is just ejected as waste heat. California, we've made great progress thanks to a lot of renewable, like this solar array on the roof at Lassen Volcanic National Park. We cut greenhouse gas emissions 14% since 2004, and we met our goal of reducing emissions below 1990 levels. We met that goal early. Wildfires contribute to greenhouse gas emissions in the state. My colleagues and I published the first analysis of carbon stocks and changes across California ecosystems. And again, and we found for the first time that ecosystems in the state from 2000 to 2010 were net emitters greenhouse gas emissions. We see the green areas some growth, but we see in the brown areas actually wildfires. And wildfires accounted for 2/3 of the emissions. The 6% of the land that burned accounted for 2/3 of the ecosystem emissions. Nevertheless, the wildfires during that time only accounted for approximately 5% of state emissions. So California has greatly supported the installation and expansion of renewable energy, and renewable energy systems have now increased to nearly half of electricity generation, including this solar array at Yosemite National Park. And California has also succeeded in decoupling economic activity from greenhouse gas emissions through energy efficiency. We've powered a growth in economic activity and a growth in population in the state. Here, the green line is a gross domestic product in the state. The blue line is population, which have increased. At the same time, greenhouse gas emissions, we've reduced greenhouse gas emissions in the state. We've become more efficient with fewer greenhouse gas emissions per person and fewer greenhouse gas emissions per dollar of gross domestic product. So some of the particular local solutions, one is a natural solution, is forest conservation, and coast redwoods attain the highest amount of carbon per square on the ground in the world, almost 10 times as much as in tropical rainforest. And colleagues and I analyzed, and we found that the carbon in all of the vegetation in the 27 national parks in California store an amount equivalent to 1 year of carbon emissions from everybody in Los Angeles and these other cities. 7 million Americans, it's a lot of people. But actually, it's a lot of carbon. But actually, it's not a lot. It's not a lot. It's only 1 year. So in 1 year, 7 million people can burn off the equivalent of everything in the redwoods and the sequoias. So this points to the need to focus on fossil fuels. Natural solutions are insufficient. Fossil fuel emissions reductions are necessary. And of course, some of these practices are common sense, and especially to the green team at Golden Gate, you have put these into place. But looking at the science, it puts this into even starker relief that walking and biking produce such a small fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions of driving. And these emissions from the bus and the bicycles, this is life cycle analysis. So it includes the emissions that go into the production of the bicycle, the production of the bus, and the production of the cars. And you see such a small fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions from driving. Renewable energy, again, common sense. You're not burning fossil fuels. Renewable energy, you see in the graph down here from IPCC, such a small fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions of non-renewable sources. And again, this is life cycle analysis. This includes all of the energy put into producing the photovoltaic panels and the materials for the windmills at Crissy Field Center. And I'm going to be wrapping up in just a few minutes to take questions. I'll go through a few more of these local actions. Something as simple as just drinking water from a glass can save so much energy and greenhouse gas emissions. So in a mine in West Africa, the company is is mining bauxite ore, put it in a ship. They ship it over to a smelter, which burns, which heats the ore to almost 1,000 degrees Celsius, or over 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Produce the can. In this case, incredulously, Coca-Cola puts water in the can, and then somebody drinks that, and they throw it away, which is, we all know, is such an incredible waste. It's a lot of embodied energy, a lot of embodied greenhouse gas emissions. For that one new can, that produces up to 60 kilograms of carbon dioxide in emissions. Okay, so recycling really helps. One thing that Golden Gate did was they reduced their emissions 30%, and then they calculated the remaining emissions. They purchased offsets offsite at a dairy farm to recover waste methane. This is a carbon offset. They purchased a reduction of emissions offsite to balance the emissions on-site. And I'm putting up these offset principles for your reference later. It's very important to carefully analyze this transaction to make sure that that it produces a net benefit to the atmosphere. And the most important principle is additionality. The activity is new. It's over and above any current or planned activities. So your funding of methane recovery, the methane recovery would not have occurred in the absence of your funding. And I've worked on these projects in Latin America, in Peru, conserving rainforest and reforestation also. And Laura is going to talk next about this great achievement institutionally. But scientific analyses have also shown that your individual actions reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. And just by living a car-free life, I live a car-free life. I'm grateful to be able to do that. I've had one car a long time ago in undergrad, and I walked, biked, used public transit to the rest of my life. And depending on the car and on your driving, you could just getting rid of your car could be 10 to 20% of your emissions right there. In each of these sustainable actions, buying green energy, PG&E offers a solar choice where they take people's funds from their bills, they build it up, and they build a new solar capacity over and above what they're required to do by the state. So green energy programs like that. A lot of your personal choices can have substantial greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And so in conclusion, I encourage you to take what you're doing, and so many of you do this already, I know, but if you haven't taken some of these steps, I encourage you to try it out, and remember that billions of small, unsustainable actions created the problem of climate change. So billions of sustainable actions, however small, can solve the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was so amazing. And I had some private chats while you were talking that were saying, wow, I can't believe Patrick works for the Park Service. It's so inspiring. So
thank you.
Warms our hearts in more ways than you can know. So we have 6 minutes for questions, and our lovely assistant Michaela is monitoring the chats. And so if you want to ask Patrick a question, hopefully you figured out how to open up the chat box. As a reminder, down on the bottom center of your screen, there's the little circles, and you can turn on and off your video and mic there. And then there's also the open the chat. So Michaela, have we gotten any questions for Patrick?
Sure. First question is, what is bunker in the list of greenhouse gas sources?
Oh. That's like a common energy term that's all thrown around. It's the oil that's stored in the big marine tanks and the big tanks at airports, and it actually represents about 7%. So of approximately 7% of emissions. And the way it's counted when the oil, the aviation fuel, enters the bunker, it's an easier way of counting greenhouse gases.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, how do you think the COVID-19 crisis is impacting climate change, as many people are not driving or using other resources as much? Although, some people are still shopping online and not sure if that's a high impact or not. What do you think about that?
Well, the global systems of counting energy and quantifying greenhouse gases will give us the quantitative answer to this. And I think the indications clearly show that greenhouse gas emissions have reduced in this time. I will say to you that I'd give back all of those greenhouse gas emissions reductions to get back the 200,000 more people who have died. And I'd give back all those reductions to relieve the suffering of people around the world. And so let's try to honor their memory and loss by taking care of our common home.
Thank you, Patrick. Very, very well said.
So I think we only have time for one more question. And what we are going to offer to do is, throughout the day, we're actually going to be keeping track of all of the questions. And if we didn't get to it because of time constraints, because we're going to run a tight ship here, then we will work with the presenters and try to get some written responses and answer back to you. So in the interest of time, Michaela, can you pick out one more question that you want Patrick to answer?
Sure. There's a couple questions in here I think might be addressed later. So I'm going to go with, are there unified efforts across the national parks to communicate climate change with visitors and park staff, like in visitor centers or employee trainings, things like that?
The national parks do have a climate change response program that works on some aspects of communications. I think the Golden Gate National Recreation Area interpretive staff have been really great with their communications on the website and on interpretive panels. And the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy has had me out actually, and has had other events on communicating climate change. KQED, I remember had an event in the Presidio highlighting and encouraging people to take action on climate change in national parks. So San Francisco and Golden Gate have been real leaders in communicating the science of climate change and its human cause. So I'd encourage you to talk with the interpretive staff there. So, and I would encourage all of you to continue talking about climate change and its human cause. The human cause of climate change is important in reducing greenhouse because it points to the solution, and the solution is what you're working on. And thank you for your work to conserve natural resources and to conserve America's most special places, the national parks.
Awesome, Patrick. Thank you so much. That is such a great segue to some of the other talks that are going to be going on today. So in the comments, for example, we were getting some questions about community choice programs. That's definitely what Ellie will be touching on. The Climate Center that she's the CEO of predominantly works with CCAs. So stick around after lunch, and then kind of what you were saying about everyone being part of the solution and questions of individual solutions versus community solutions. That's what our entire final segment at 2:45 is going to be about. So you're just going to have to stick around. We can't expect Patrick to cover every single thing that there is to talk about. So thank you so much. And what we're going to do now is we're going to have a 15-minute break.